My name is Al Motes. I'm the senior data librarian at the University of Bath, and I can just sort of give you a brief overview of like what we're going to do today. So first of all, I want to say welcome to everyone to our second event in the GW4 Open Research Week, and we will be recording this session, just so you're aware. And also I wanted to highlight to you our keynote tomorrow, which is going to be by Marcus Manafo, who is one of the sort of shining lights in the open research world and one of the co-founders of the UKRN. He's going to be our keynote tomorrow, talking about sort of selfish reasons to be open. So we hope that you can join us for that tomorrow, starting at 12:30, as well as our prize award event that follows that. So welcome again. And today we're going to be talking about sort of sensitive data. And the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves. And then I'm hoping to just have a bit of a conversation with folks. And then we will leave time at the end for any questions from the audience. So if you do have any questions, do feel free to pop those in the Q&A. But there will be some time also at the end as well. And I think people will be able to unmic if they feel like it to also ask questions. So what I'd like to do is have our panelists introduce themselves. So if everyone could just sort of give their name and where they're coming from, perhaps a little understanding of their area of expertise, and maybe like what kind of data they are used to handling, or what kind of sort of sensitivities they may be thinking about in their areas of expertise. So that's name, affiliation, area, and sort of experience with sensitive data. Maybe I'll start with our special guest, Amy, who's actually joining us from the US right now. So Amy, do you want to kick us off?
Oh, thank you so much. I'd be delighted to. Hi, Al. My name is Amy Nernberger. I am the program head for data management services at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm also part of the current effort in the US and also globally called the Data Rescue Project, which is helping to manage some of the data that perhaps would not have previously been classified as sensitive, but is now certainly at risk. So thank you very much for the invitation, Alice and all.
Great. Next, how about Logan?
Hello, I'm Logan Wade. I'm a research fellow from the University of Bath. So I work in human imaging, so imaging patients walking across. So this is clinical patients, but also health participants. And then I'm starting to get in a little bit of medical imaging, which is ultrasound.
Great, thank you. Anya?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep, great. Okay. Hi, I'm Anea Prosser. So I'm an assistant professor here at Bath in marketing, business and society. I also recently received the UKRN Dorothy Bishop Prize for my efforts championing open qualitative research. So that gives you a little bit of a clue as to what kind of data I work with. So I predominantly work with qualitative data. In particular, I do a lot of focus groups and interviews, and I'm also doing some field work as well, so I can reflect on that. In terms of sensitivity, I talk about climate change, which again, it was interesting, Amy, that you were talking about data that was previously not sensitive has immediately become sensitive. So I do work on climate change and activism, which has immediately become a big issue. So I do lots of work on dietary behavior, health behaviors as well, and also some risky behaviors. I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Great, thanks. Sophia?
Hi, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Sofia Gamed, as you know. I'm a health psychologist based at the School of Psychology in Cardiff. I do research in women's health and co-lead the Women's Health Research Wales Centre. Most of my research is around reproductive health, fertility treatment. So that's the kind of data I deal with. We're very eclectic in the methods, but within that we do a lot of qualitative research, mixed methods, and kind of data that it's sensitive, has to do with reproductive loss, with experiences of care, with traumatic experiences of care. We also look at issues like menstrual health. So that's all kind of also around service provision. And as part of my role also for positive research culture, I'm involved in a training program in positive research culture at Cardiff University that was funded by the Wellcome Fund. And here we're dealing with data that would not be considered so sensitive, but given the current context in higher education in the UK, it has become more sensitive also.
Great, thank you. And Em.
Hello. So really happy to have the opportunity to talk about this topic. It's always a pleasure, honestly. So I'm Emma Tomkin from the University of Bristol, aka Em, depending on how many Emmas there are in the room. So I'm a research fellow from, as it were, computer science. Mostly I do data management and system architecture for a project called Taurus at the moment, which is a digital health project. Over time, I've worked with quite a few data types that had sensitivities, although I'm not sure we always appreciated it when we started. So it's things like event, topic, extraction from social media, that kind of thing. We got into judicial analytics, looked at upper tribunal discussions in immigration law, and this involved a lot of talking about refugees' experiences in immigration law, so lots of sensitive data there, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, political opinions, racial, ethnic origins, lots. Of course, in Taurus, which is my main thing here, we are deploying complex multi-sensor systems in participants' homes and labs, and we're doing it for healthcare purposes. Sometimes we look explicitly at healthcare data, but what we're largely trying to do is to look at this data as a proxy and decide how much information it can give us about healthcare. So we're analysing this data for healthcare purposes, also for biometric purposes, so we can tell, are we looking at the right person? How are they doing? How are their symptoms doing? So, for example, if they've had surgery, are they recovering? And so on. There we go.
Great, thanks so much. So I thought maybe we could start the discussion by just simply sort of asking folks what your motivations were for sharing data, if you have shared some sensitive data in a potentially controlled way, who you imagine the sort of audiences for that, and what sort of motivated you to do that. Does anyone want to jump in? Feel free to just unmic. This should be a pretty casual affair.
I mean, I can start. We have collected a sample data set of participants walking around our lab. This is used with motion capture and force plates, and is used predominantly with AI algorithms to track how movement has been done in these participants. So this is trying to move away from what we've normally had to do, which is place markers all over the body to track and identify human movement, and moving towards AI automatically doing this. So our motivation was to create a validation data set, because we basically came up with a wall where we couldn't validate what we were doing because there was no validation data sets really out there that were of a significant, of a good enough quality to really do what we need to do. So this has led us to putting up a data set with University of Bath Library, which manages access through that. But that's, the main reason why we wanted to do that.
That's great. Anyone else?
I don't mind to. So I guess our motivation mostly started from wanting to sharing data with colleagues, and it actually started with work we did with research participants, which were kind of arts-based workshops, and where we produced outputs with the participants, and we produced a leaflet at the end, and etc. And we noticed some things. One, the participants wanted sometimes to be identified. They wanted really to make their voices heard, and because of that, they didn't want anonymity. They wanted to be identified. They found that empowering. But of course, that kind of also raised a lot of discussions around the risks and etc. And so that started kind of pointed us more to the importance of making data accessible and sharing data and empowering those voices. When we started thinking about mostly towards other colleagues, researchers. But now we're expanding our views also in terms of also making it more accessible to kind of wider audiences, and how we can use technology to make data more, to make it easy to interact and visualize qualitative data also.
Great. Anyone else have some experience with this or motivation?
Yeah, thank you. I'd have to say that, coming from my position at a technology school, we have all sorts of different reasons why data might be sensitive. As we heard from Sophia and Logan, oftentimes there's this idea of protection and privacy, and the participants have a big voice in how much they want their own data to be considered sensitive. And that really goes into some of the care principles and really considering the community needs within that space. But we also run across issues of intellectual property and thinking about how data needs to be protected as part of an agreement with an industry partner, or if people are interested in protecting licensing and technology aspects of their research as well. And so taking those things into account. And then there's also this consideration of what it means for both producing data and thinking about sharing these research materials when sensitivities change, right? When thinking where, I think, you had mentioned that when you started out collecting some of these materials, that this wasn't necessarily a thing that was thinking, but I think that as we collect collectively more and more data, all of those data being put together also create sensitivities within that entire body of research, within that entire body of data. So thinking about how sensitivities can change both over time and with the growth of data itself. So thinking about those aspects as well. So in all of those different ways, I think it's really fascinating to think about that. And as in my position at the university doing all of these is work from data from ostrography and archaeology all the way through zoology. So we work with all types of data in those spaces and touching in all of these different types of areas. So I think you were going to say something, Em.
I completely agree with regards to the discoveries that one makes over time. When you create a data set, the tertiary uses of a data set are not always obvious as well. And it's as disciplines develop that you realize where it's going. So definitely agreed with you there. I would say we have a few primary reasons to share data, and they tend to be, reproducibility, value for money. So obviously someone's put a lot of money in so that we can do this work, and we want to maximize the impact. We also have some responsibility to researchers to maximize impact, but also to participants, because as you say, they've put themselves on the line to no small extent. They've put all that effort out there, they've participated. It's not necessarily a straightforward thing to do, especially in our case, when we're asking people to take part in a more instrumented world than a few years ago at least would have seemed commonplace. And last but not least, there is the, we ourselves put all this effort into it, and we should probably honour that as well. There's also this final reason, which is, what else do we do with it, other than destruction? That full data lifecycle question. We want it to have a destination if we possibly can, whether that's open sharing or closed sharing, or placing in a position where if someone needs to reproduce, they can access it given appropriate, purposes. We don't want to stand in the way of that. So yeah, that's my view.
I think I can just add to the end of that. I think these are all really great reasons for sharing data, and the considerations are already, this is going to be a great conversation, so I'm excited. So I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I've used both quantitative and qualitative methods, but I do tend a little bit towards qualitative methods, and specifically meta research on how qualitative researchers see openness and transparency. And I know from our research and from a lot of the conversations I've had that open data in particular is a problem for a lot of qualitative researchers. We don't know where to start. We're not sure what questions we should ask. We're not sure what is sensitive and what isn't. And I think a lot of the discussions around opening data do tend to be kind of centering numeric data or centering sort of quantitative data sets. So I think it's really important for qualitative folks to consider what openness means for them. We know from our research that a lot of qualitative folks think that opening data can be present ethical issues, and it can, but my position is also that closing data presents ethical issues too, in terms of access, in terms of diversity, in terms of inclusion, all of these things which are currently under threat. So when it comes to my own kind of experience of dealing with sensitive and potentially opening or not opening my data, I think the question that I always ask is, I sort of do that risk assessment of what is the value of opening this data? What do I want to achieve with this open data? Versus what is the risk to the participant. And I think there's a bit of a tendency, I mean, maybe this is going on to later discussions, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's a little bit of a tendency among researchers who deal with sensitive data, both quantitative and qualitative, to see things in a very black and white manner as either open or closed. And I think we need to get a lot better at looking at what the gray space is in between. So, for example, I've had, transcripts on sort of sexual harassment and assault on campuses, which are highly, highly sensitive, especially when, collected with the context given in the manuscript. But so I can't open the transcript, but I can open an extended sort of coding or extended theme table to kind of illustrate where the conclusions came from. I also find that opening data is really helpful, or opening transcripts in particular is helpful when you're trying to make a methodological contribution. So I was trying to illustrate how a focus group methodology works, and I found that it was actually really, really difficult to do that within the confines of a journal article. Whereas if I could provide the transcripts for people to go and look at themselves, they could independently verify the claims that I was making. Not so they could reproduce them, but just so they could see sort of my thought process and how it might apply to their context. So that's where I come from this, but I think we're going to discuss a lot more, so I'm going to shut up right now.
No, thanks so much. I mean, I think that that's an underlying tension, I think, that exists in, this discussion, which is what is the sort of balance between being sort of open, transparent, all the reasons why we would want to share data, reproducibility, accessibility, those kind of things, but then also, how we get to that openness, right? And does that require, de-identification to the point where perhaps reuse is not as it's not as useful data, right? I was wondering if anyone could speak to going through that sort of balancing process with some data that they've chosen, and perhaps like what strategies you use to try and balance that, or if you've just grappled with it and you don't have a good answer. I've stunned you all into silence. Oh, Sophia, do you want to comment?
Yes. So I'll come in and just to complement the last question, I think, because it also one of the things that we also observed is that we all live in very kind of data-rich environments where we have access to a lot of data, and in a way that I think sometimes contributes for us to being a little bit more mundane about the way we deal with our data. And one of the things that we've observed is that people would engage in secondary data analysis with external people to the university, or people who weren't initially in the ethics, and in a way that represented lack of transparency to what was initially told to participants when they consented. But those people at the same time would have a lot of concerns about making data open because of all the kind of sensitivities. And these kind of processes were one of the things that led me to actually think, no, we just need to be fully transparent around these. And the way to do it is to discuss openness from the start. Now, one of the reasons why I'm here today is because I was involved with Kelly in a project where, because in my area, we do a lot of co-production in health, where we got together with stakeholders, usually the people with whom we produce the research, to produce guidance on open research and how to involve our PPI partners in those decisions. And so we've now have a guidance, but also what came through was a list of principles that our partners thought were important. And one of related now more with the question, one around the level of the identification and how partners are probably the ones that are best placed to estimate risk and how they should be actively involved in those decisions because they have their own experience, or they have access to people who have had different experiences, or they can go back to them and also ask, although we could also ask our participants directly. And so we've put in place a series of processes to trigger questions around how you can engage with your PPIs in these decisions. Now, in terms of my own process, I am in the process of making decisions around. So far, we didn't come across with situations where we felt like a whole set of data was impossible to de-identify. But we now are in the situation where we have people in such specific roles that there is no way to de-identify those interviews, regardless of how much you take out of the interview, to a point that it makes it meaningless. So we haven't made decisions around this, but the things we're considering putting for discussion are putting an embargo, so not making these interviews open in the first instance. And this is a subgroup of participants within a larger research project. Going back to the participants and asking them to which degree would you feel comfortable if you were identifiable, and would there be any options that you would feel comfortable around these when creating an embargo, or two, only sharing these interviews under, a data sharing agreement where people would commit for non-disclosure. Those were kind of the solutions that have come to mind at the moment. But if other people have other ideas or other experiences, it would also be great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it sort of gets to the heart of another question I wanted to pose to folks, which is, when we're thinking about our participants, does anyone have a sense of what they understand, like sharing data to mean? Because I think oftentimes it'll just be one of the tick boxes on the consent forms. But do you have a sense about what participants actually sort of understand data sharing to mean, and how do you potentially approach those conversations? Does that influence how you craft your consent forms, those conversations that you have, if anyone wants to speak to that?
We've tried to use sort of co-design, co-production as far as possible with participants, which is quite a long way, both to sort of understand their own sort of hinterland and, their motivations, their concerns, and, really what they want out of it. Because it's been very clear to us for a while that different groups of participants have radically different views. And I think this can be encapsulated by thinking about if you're a person who, let's say you live in an assisted living facility, but you do not tend to fall. Perhaps you think a camera is something that is an invasion of privacy, and to you are quite right, it has no obvious positive benefit for your purpose. If you're a person who has had falls, then you start seeing it radically differently in terms of its benefit to you as an individual. Now, obviously, we're not providing direct products here. It's more of a sort of indirect, here's how this can potentially have a benefit for people with a similar circumstance to you or living with a similar condition, such as, for example, Parkinson's. But one comes to realize that, for example, people with Parkinson's are really much less concerned, by and large, as a group, about being non-identifiable and much more concerned about the potential benefits for the future for others. So the upshot, as you might say, the upshot of the data sharing for them, they would like to know, what data is being shared, why is it being shared, and how it can potentially lead to a certain benefit. That largely wouldn't be directly in a consent form, but it would be encapsulated in a participant information sheet, and the consent form would be, specific granular consent to give them the opportunity to respond to each of those things. The flip side of this, though, is for us to do this properly, I think we need to be able to give a realistic assessment of risks. And in practice, I mean, if people don't mind being identifiable and they're perfectly happy to share biometrics, i.e. show up on a video, as indeed we're kind of doing right now, then there may not be a problem talking about, you may be re-identifiable. But sometimes we have an urge to say things like, you are anonymous on this, or you are functionally anonymous or practically anonymous, or any of a large set of weasel words. And when we are going to start, I don't mean that meanly, but we do need to be specific about what we're claiming. And I think that is inherently very, very difficult, especially when it comes to innovative technologies, where we ourselves might not understand the impact, as we discussed earlier.
I mean, just following on from that point, we had a similar case where we were recording videos of participants, and in our case, we cannot de-identify because the AI doesn't work if you have a big black box over someone's face, and then it just kind of freaks out because it's never seen an image like that before. So we were very concerned about making sure that that tick box that says I'm happy for my video to be publicly released on the internet didn't get lost within that consent tick form. And so we specifically had a separate consent form. So we had your standard research consent form, and we had a separate one that said public release of data, just to make sure that was very, very clear to their participants so that they understood exactly what they were signing and it wasn't going to get lost in that. As well, just as another way to try to
I would agree with both of those on the importance of working with and consulting with the community. You may well be familiar with the CARE principles as applied to Indigenous data, but I've also seen these applied in areas of medical and healthcare, especially when working with a specific community or a patient population. And I think that, it really those really continue to hit home with those ideas of what is the collective benefit to this population? Is there a collective benefit? And thinking about that within the risk calculation, as well as where do authority to control, responsibility, and ethics beyond the legalities? What are the ethics of the questions here? And those ethics vary from population to population, and with the research that you're performing as well, which I think goes back to the comments that a few people have made already, thinking about what is that spectrum of sensitivity, and how do we interpret those sensitivities? How do we interpret those risks into the actual principles that we're going to follow in terms of security when it comes to the actual practice within our research as we collect, as we manage, as we think about sharing? And also keeping in mind that oftentimes, there are a number of different repositories out there as well who approach sharing, who approach openness in different ways with different mechanics when it comes to those. Whether you're talking about the qualitative data repository, it's a delightful set of people who is very happy to work with, the qualitative research from beginning to end to really understand what it is that your research requires, and thinking in those places. Or a place like I sit on the advisory board of the Vivli repository, which is clinical data for clinical studies, and thinking about their approach to it, where they keep like all of the data behind a wall. And as a researcher, you submit your questions about the data, and they answer the questions and give the answers back to you. So there's absolutely no data that anyone sees that shouldn't be seeing it. Or someplace like ICPSR, who has dealt with a very similar situation with, video data in classrooms where you cannot show the faces of the children or the teachers in those places. And so setting up what are those criteria for getting access to the data? How do you assess the researchers and their research questions and determine who should have access to that data and why, and what's that judgment? I think the sensitive data is there is no one good way, there's no one only way, because the situations are so varied across all of these different things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said so far. I want to offer some context from my teaching experience. So I teach marketing ethics, and part of that is data ethics. And I prepared an entire, presentation expecting my students to be, I think, rightfully concerned about how their data is being used by lots of different companies. And actually, the way that a lot of my younger students responded was in a quite actual cynical way. So it's not necessarily the case that communities are going to see that what their data could be used for. They're not necessarily going to think that sharing data is a bad thing, but it's really important to illuminate exactly what is going on to participants' data nonetheless. So a lot of my students were kind of like, oh yeah, I just assumed that all of my data is being collected. And, there's this joke about the FBI officer like looking at my search history and like being surprised. Like, there are memes about this. Like, I think younger generations in particular expect that they are being surveilled in a way that older generations rightfully find quite uncomfortable. So I think that's a sort of, micro example, but it's a really good way to visualize that lots of different communities are coming into this with different expectations around what their data is used for, and that you kind of really need to handle that with that community. So I think principles that other panelists had talked about, including the care principles, co-production, is really, really important. I often find as well that we talk about informed consent a lot, and I do worry about how much our participants are truly informed or how much they are just ticking the boxes so that they can get on to participation. I think as social researchers or people, researching humans, I think we really need to find ways to better engage and share what we're doing. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is get participants to express, informed consent, not just to data sharing, but to the specific license of the data that I'm using. So they are aware that, for example, when I share data, I usually don't share it. I CC by ND with NC non-commercial, because that's just kind of one value that I have, that if I'm doing research for the public benefit, I don't really want that to be monetized and locked off for someone else's gain. That's something that I find important. And I would really like for participants to understand what that is and what's happening. And I think if you are using data for commercial or potentially commercial reasons, it is absolutely right and necessary to let your participants know that that's happening, because that also might change whether they want to participate. It might change what kind of compensation they expect. But again, I care a lot about licensing because I'm a methodologist. Most people find this incredibly boring. So we need to find ways of making this engaging for lots of different communities who are coming to this debate with lots of different levels of understanding. And people don't care a lot of the time, I find.
Yeah, I was gonna ask everyone about sort of how they are thinking about risks for their participants, and perhaps you might be thinking about more of the risks than participants themselves are thinking about the risks. I'm wondering about, we've kind of touched on this subject a bit in the course of this conversation, but I'm wondering about thinking about the sort of the future, if we're projecting forward. Do you think that there are going to be sort of different types of risks potentially in the future to different types of privacy, or thinking perhaps in the way in which we collect the data, or if we're thinking, long-term preservation of the data, are those risks changing? Can you imagine how that may be different for your own data, or if you want to just speculate wildly, I'm up for that too. Yes, Sophia, please.
Thank you. I guess three ideas. With kind of in the dialogue we have with our PPI partners, they struggle between the idea of wanting to kind of amplify their voices with the idea that there are differences in power in accessing data. And, there are people who have the financial means to process large amounts of data. for, whatever agendas that can be contrary to the motivations of people and groups to put out the data. And they really struggle with where is the right balance for them. The other idea around commercialization also, I've had also different experiences. Well, when questioning, can you actually ever, have control over that? And even if you don't allow access to that data, you write papers where, the knowledge is there and can be used, or you've gained some expertise around that data that if you do, partnerships, it's being informed by that data, etc. But also several of our PPI partners also said no, because I want innovation, I want new services, I want new products that to address unmet needs that I have currently. And we have to be realistic that many of those things will only come with industry. So there's really a plurality of views from the different groups, I think. And I was going to say something else, which has now eluded me. There was another idea. Sorry.
You can bring it back to us. Yeah.
It comes back. Yep. What was your final question?
Oh yeah, so I guess the question really was just about whether or not you anticipate there being different types of risks or the sources of risks potentially being different in the future for either collection or I think something that Amy's dealing with right now is if we're thinking about the long-term preservation of sensitive data, are there potential risks that may come up that we're not seeing right now?
Yeah, one idea I was going to put, but probably many people or most people are aware of this, is actually the imbalance in data that it's available for AI to work with. And of course, all the disparities it creates, which, it's striking in terms of sex and gender, on the basis of that, half of the population will be of one sex. But of course, it's even more striking if we go to other protected characteristics also. And in a way, we almost feel that, more data should be out there to counterbalance this. But there's also risks involved with that. I'll leave it to you. Yeah.
Yes, the implicit biases that are in AI generative models, the large language models, is something I think we need to be constantly aware of, especially as, I see more and more researchers are like, oh, did you see the cool thing I made with AI? And I'm like, yes, but have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And on the other side of that, the other face of that coin, though, is I've also spoken with researchers who are like, I have this amazing data set, often quantitative, that I can't share because of personally identifiable information, the PII that's held within that data set. But I can use AI, a generative AI model, to create a twinned data set, right? Something that has all of the same characteristics, but doesn't reveal that data, and exploring how that might be a tool to bridge some of those sharing challenges, right? How can we use this tool appropriately so that it's of a benefit to our populations, to the world at large, rather than at a cost to them? So one side is articulating for many large language models, to be frank, the outright theft of work, right? The lack of representation, the implicit biases, whether we're talking gender, race, language, all of these different personal characteristics. The other side is, what can we do that would be useful with this, that would be beneficial for these things? And I think Alice, as you indicated, thinking about risks that we might not acknowledge right now, but might come to our data at some point in time. So, aspects that perhaps weren't necessarily considered as part of such a protected class or at such a risk, say, for instance, 6 months ago, but now are very much sensitive, very much becoming a much more protected class because that class of people is now subject to different restrictions, is being subject to different overwatch to an extent, right? Thinking about what those are. Another risk of data that, within the US that we're currently dealing with, and it impacts the rest of the world as well, is the risk of data disappearing or data being altered without knowing what those alterations are. And thinking about what does that look like if we think about it as data belonging to the global research community rather than to a specific population or a specific institution or a specific political entity, nation, or region in those ways. And so thinking more largely about how do we understand sensitivity then on a global scale when we're thinking about that sensitivity and risks to data. So thinking about those types of things, and together collectively as a research community, what is the infrastructures that we start thinking about putting in place to protect data so there is not, for instance, a purely hypothetical situation, one country that holds a ton of climate data that the whole world uses. And all of a sudden, we're all asking, what's going to happen to that? Where is it going to go? How is it going to be managed? Can I still trust that data? Can I still trust those collections that have existed? And how do I know about those things? So being frank and honest with ourselves, again, globally, for our research communities globally, how do we start thinking about these in more constructive ways, and what, both for what's happening right now, but how do we think about that going forward? So I had mentioned earlier that I'm part of the Data Rescue Project, which is one organization who's working on this. But I'm also part of the Research Data Alliance. I sit on council there, and there are a number of groups in there who think about sensitive data as well, and thinking about those data infrastructures. So as ways to start thinking about encouraging and just bringing those aspects into conversation about how do we understand risks that aren't just the risks that we know, like we've already talked about, but the risks that may come to be. What are the things we put in place? What are the behaviors we start deploying, and the development of nuanced understandings in those spaces?
Yeah, the Data Rescue Project is a really great example of when openness and transparency can be really societally beneficial for lots of people. And I'm aware that there are a huge amount of efforts in the US and other countries to try and reclaim some of this data. And I'm a huge admirer of what you're all doing. It's really, really amazing. But it is a very good example of the kind of scary consequences of these things. So I've published a couple of papers looking at the nuances of qualitative open data. And as part of these papers, we were trying to come up with sort of future scenarios, thinking about, like, for example, if we can't see the risks, then we can't accommodate them in future. So we're trying to come up with some hypothetical future risks. And actually, by the time those papers went through peer review and got published, those hypotheticals were very much not hypothetical at all. And in some cases, we actually had to amend our discussion to reflect, the changing literature. So I guess there is one thing which I would highly recommend, is that all researchers of all different disciplines and methodologies really stay attuned to the changing societal, economic, political context across the world in relation to their research area. I mean, even for the UK, I do research on climate activism, and peaceful protest wasn't criminalized when I started the research. And now with the police crime and sentencing bill, it very much is. So I have data that is open that talks about disruptive actions that I'm like, if I hadn't anonymized that appropriately or effectively enough, that could be used to prosecute someone or to put them in jail at this point. Now, that's, not great for society in general, but it kind of keeps me up at night, like how much researchers hoping to have a positive effect on communities can also become, instruments by which state violence is conducted. That's sort of the extreme end, but I think it's becoming much more common. The flip side of that is I think there's a huge potential for openness and transparency and sharing data to minimize some of these inequalities, to help build solidarity across lots of different people, across different nations, different types of people, different contexts. If you open up your data, then a researcher who has fewer resources will be able to access it and build on your work even if they can't access these things. So I think there are huge benefits to sort of impact and to equity and diversity and inclusion, but that's also a double-edged sword. So I think what I'm kind of recommending for a lot of researchers now is to think about openness and sort of narrativize your approach rather than adhering to any one specific practice and thinking that's enough. Really provide explanations and accompanying metadata and accompanying context of the decisions you are making. So, for example, you could say, actually, you could attach in your supplementary material your plans for data sharing, and you could say in that data sharing that it became sensitive and you had to deviate from the pre-registration and you had to deviate from your plans. Be open about these things, because it's not necessarily more ethical to open something up and then not rethink that as context change. So yeah, I think it's very much a really, really big issue, but the more reflexivity we can incorporate and the more we can share our decision making and our narratives, the easier it will be for all of us to reckon with.
I do completely agree, especially something that comes to my mind a lot is data audits. So returning to data on a regular basis, which we typically do for data preservation purposes, are the file formats a bit older, is it all still readable, and, is it adequately coded, and so on and so forth. And sometimes that just helps us to understand what we don't know about a data set. But I feel like along with the rest of data preservation, something we've been talking about for a while is that, machine learning in particular introduces some interesting problems that maybe we haven't thoroughly thought about in this area, but not uniquely. But again, this is old problems expressed with new ideas. But when new ideas come up, people have a tendency to present them in a slightly utopian way. So it's like, oh, federated learning, it's totally anonymous. Is it though? And on we go, right? And our synthetic data definitely doesn't leak data. Well, we don't think it does, or this model definitely doesn't leak data, or at least we haven't caught it doing yet, right? And so coming back to those points, along with all of those other points, bias, fairness, all these things, seems like something we should be doing later in the data life cycle when it moves on to a sort of maintenance schedule. But I have yet to really see anyone say, this is how we would update data audit for this purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open it up to the audience to ask a question. And I think we have a question in the chat. Is that right, Kate?
Yes, we do. And thank you, Amy, for leaving an answer there. I suppose we can throw it out to the group as well. It's from Rain, who asked, how should the data preservation infrastructure, e.g. repositories, and culture change adapt to accommodate such changes in data sensitivity over a long time scale?
Well, I think I can jump in very quickly. I think librarians and in the Netherlands, they have this job role called data stewards. So maybe making sure that there is support to allow researchers to be able to make choices, and there is sort of guidance and procedures for people who do want to change things. Because I think at the moment, a lot of us are kind of working in the dark about these things, and the more that we can talk about it, the better. And maybe, learning from other areas. I think historians are a really good example of how to kind of change, how to collect data and how to ensure its longevity. And but I also want to acknowledge that I think there is a huge workload to all of this, and it's a workload that is perhaps not recognized or acknowledged within at least the academy. Maybe it is an industry, but I think we need to change the alignments of recognition and incentives so that this kind of work is valued as just as important as publication. I think that's really, really crucial.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with that so much. And I'd love to see so much more dialogue. So I come from information library science in some ways. And I've been so surprised as to how little direct communication there is, because it's like they're different worlds. And you're like, but you do so much similar stuff. You have so many, related expertise. It doesn't make sense. You're not, chatting. And I would like to see, in the same way as I'm aware of like data ethics discussion infrastructure, I'd like to see sort of, risk exploration discussion infrastructure, and, just talking about the sort of the current horizon and understanding that we have of, different relevant themes to whatever it is we're exploring as our specialist sensitive subject, and just getting together and talking would be a really nice first step. I know it's not super technical, but that's how you start building standards, and frameworks. So I'd really like to see more of that.
I can add to that discussion also within the principles we've kind of co-produced with our PPI partners. One was about strong governance support and rigor, and how in academia the kind of endeavor of open science falls into individual groups or individuals or small teams, and many times this is also allocated for earlier career researchers who, of course, if there are issues arising, or if certain risks then become the reality, they're in a more vulnerable situation in terms of accountability. But also the other idea that was very strongly expressed is that when we do engage with partners in co-producing open science, it also has to be at the governance level. They have to be involved in those more future-orientated discussions, kind of big vision, and not in decisions around this one singular project or that one singular project. And that universities should be engaging with these partners and should be creating that governance structure that supports academics and our kind of stakeholders in this endeavor.
Great. Matt, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks for that discussion. Sort of following up on that, having had some experience with this myself, I think one of the things I struggle with is, as an individual researcher, it's a lot of the risk you have to take on yourself. And there's plenty of guidance out there on like data anonymization, for example, but the institutions don't have a clear policy on what's an appropriate level of anonymization, and so the buck stops at you as the researcher, as it often does. So I guess it comes back to some of the professional services questions we talked about yesterday, and having enough staff in place who know this in detail and a policy. So I guess I was wondering the panel's thoughts on, like the involvement of ethics committees, for example, who often can be caught surprised by these questions. I'm in a medical school, I guess, and they're very risk averse, right? How do you pursue open research in that context?
Amy,
Sorry.
Amy raised her hand, and then you, Em. How's that sound?
Just really quickly, that's a great point. And I think, across the research endeavor, we expect, investigators and researchers to know their discipline area, to be able to, create those questions and answer those questions. We don't, on top of that, necessarily expect them to understand all of the ins and outs of data and taking care of data. And what does it mean when you put these three disparate data sets together when you didn't know about one of them and what's revealed during that, right? And I think it really brings forward the point you had made before about data stewardship, right? And thinking about what is that role within that space of data, and how much important has it become, especially with the introduction of AI in all of its glory in different types, because not just generative AI, but all of the things we now call AI again, because yay, buzzwords. But it all relies on well-maintained, managed and documented data at the end of the day, right? And so really considering that data generation, the collection of data, and all of those research outputs that are necessary to understand the data as a wealth of our institutions, and as an investment area for our institutions to make sure that those resources are well taken care of and well maintained. And it's that putting forth that case, because we know stewardship isn't shiny, right? It doesn't get the glory. It's not sparkly, as you said, Anaya. No one really wants to hear about policies and ethics a lot. Equally, no one wants to hear about like, this is the document structure for your data. This is how it's going to be great for you. They're like, oh, could I go do my research now, right? But thinking about how to present those stories about how important it is to care for what are truly the foundational resources of much of our research institutions, of all of the research that we've collectively done, because all of that builds on that foundation of data. So thank you. And please.
Sorry, very, very last, very, very brief. Just wanted to remind that in UK, EU universities, you will have a DPO, generally data protection officer. I mean, you should have. And so you're not quite as on your own as you think, if you like. So you can get support building DPIAs, so understanding, impact assessments and so on and so forth. So absolutely do lean on those resources. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, Chris is on the call. Chris Tibbs is a tremendous help in my personal.
Well, there we go. But it's great to let people know.
I guess it's just that like there's a longer term conversation about universities having a proper policy on appropriate levels of anonymization, so the researcher just doesn't have to take it all themselves.
I do completely agree. I think it would be great if at the university level and also at like the ICO level in the UK, or analogously elsewhere, that there would be a technical equivalent, if you like, of this interpretive group that exists to, try and help you understand policy. So there are, data protection groups that exist in part to try and help with policy, but they tend on the whole not to be super technical detail oriented in terms of really being able to say, okay, yeah, your method works N% of the time and gives you this percent de-anonymization, which is adequate for your specific statistical purpose, which is a slightly different problem. Yeah. So I do agree with you. I just don't know how to persuade people that this is needed. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We are at time now, so I'm going to draw this to a close. But I did want to just say a big thank you to all of our panelists for their time today. And also a big thank you to Kate for all the help behind the scenes, as well as Sasha, Kelly, and Chris for helping recruit all these fine panelists. And I hope to see you guys again soon for some of the other great events that we were doing during the week, including our keynote tomorrow. So hope to see you there. Thank you very much.